I almost didn't go to the will reading. My father made it clear long before he died that I was the afterthought of the family, the one he spoke about with a shrug, the one he introduced to people as my daughter from my first marriage, like it was a distant memory instead of a full life. He raised my half-brother, Marcus, like a prince. Private schools, business trips, mentorship. Me, I was the shadow in the photos. I was the, quote, in kid, end quote, the name misspelled in birthday cards, when he remembered them at all. So when the lawyer called and said, "Your presence is requested," I nearly declined, but my son, Caleb, convinced me. "You have every right to hear his final words," he said, "even if they're just silence." Caleb was 16, sharp as glass, and twice as clear-eyed. He didn't say much, but when he did, I listened. So I put on a plain dress, tied my hair back, and walked into that law office with my chin up, even if my heart was dragging. The room was as cold as I expected. Oak table, leather chairs, a pitcher of untouched water. Marcus was already seated, smug in his tailored blazer, flanked by his wife and their two boys who barely looked up from their phones. Aunt Joyce was there too, Dad's sister and loyal defender, always ready to remind me how difficult my mother had been and how complicated things were back then. No one looked surprised when I walked in, just mildly annoyed like someone had let the wrong person into a private club. "Didn't think you show," Marcus said, not bothering to stand. "Didn't think it mattered," I replied, sliding into the chair beside Caleb. His hand slipped into mine under the table and I squeezed it tightly. The lawyer, a pale man with tired eyes, cleared his throat and began. "As per the last will and testament of Robert T. Wainwright, we will proceed with the formal reading." That's when the air shifted, because no matter how much you expect to be excluded, hearing it out loud is different. One by one, the gifts were read. The vacation home in Florida went to Marcus, the collection of rare watches, Marcus again, the investment portfolio, the car, the boat, the stocks, the safe deposit box, Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. My name didn't come up once. Not a lamp, not a family photo, not even the fake palm tree he used to keep in the garage. Joyce received a painting she once complimented. The lawyer droned on like this was routine. I sat there with my spine straight and my chest tight, refusing to blink. Then it happened. The line I knew was coming, but still felt like a slap when it hit. "To my daughter, Dana, I leave the satisfaction of knowing she was raised strong enough to need nothing from me." Laughter followed, quiet at first, then louder. Joyce chuckled. Marcus's wife actually snorted. Marcus leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Figures." I didn't say a word, but Caleb, he let go of my hand, stood up slowly, and said, "Excuse me. I think you're all forgetting something." The room froze. Everyone turned to look at him, my quiet son, standing there in jeans and a hoodie, holding a worn leather folder I didn't even know he'd brought. "You all think this is funny," he said, voice calm, "but you might want to hear what my grandfather forgot to include in this little show." The lawyer blinked. "Young man, this isn't—" "Actually," Caleb said, "this is important." He handed the folder to the lawyer. "Please read that. Out loud, now." I looked at Caleb, heart racing. What was he doing? What was this? The lawyer opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages. His eyes widened, his jaw tensed. Then, with a cautious breath, he began to read. "Attached are original land deeds, trust documents, and signed statements from Robert T. Wainwright dated over 17 years ago." Marcus's face twisted. "What is this?" Caleb stood straighter. "That is the legacy you all laughed at. The part of the estate none of you knew about. And guess what? It's not in his name anymore." The room went silent. And for the first time in my life, I watched their confidence crack. I sat there, frozen, heart thudding like it was trying to climb out of my chest. Caleb didn't sit back down. He didn't hesitate. He simply turned to face every person who had laughed at me moments earlier and said, "You should probably let the lawyer finish reading." The lawyer cleared his throat, straightened the documents, and continued. "These documents include a notarized amendment signed in 2007 establishing a private land trust known as the DC Legacy Trust, the DNC standing for Dana and Caleb Wainwright. The trust owns a 14-acre commercial lot purchased under Robert T. Wainwright's name and transferred 3 months later." He paused. "The current beneficiaries of the trust are Dana Wainwright and Caleb Wainwright. Solely." The silence that followed felt like a lightning strike. Marcus's face contorted. "This is fake," he said, standing up. There's no way Dad left you anything. I handled his accounts. I saw everything. The lawyer calmly adjusted his glasses. Sir, the documents are real, verified. This was filed separately and legally executed. It was not stored with the main will because it predates his estate plan. He looked at me. It's yours. All of it. I stared at Caleb, stunned. How? When? He smiled, soft and calm. I found the papers in Grandpa's old storage bin last year. Remember when we cleaned out that unit for him after his knee surgery? You were organizing files. I was boxing books. I opened a leather file that didn't look like it belonged. I did remember. I hadn't thought anything of it. Just tossed it in the keep pile and moved on. Caleb continued. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I did some research. Took it to a friend's dad. He's a probate attorney. We verified everything. I didn't want to say anything unless it was real. I blinked, barely processing it. Why didn't you tell me? He looked me dead in the eye. Because I knew how they treat you, and I wanted them to do it first so they'd hear the truth while they were still laughing. I looked around the table. All the smugness had vanished. Marcus's wife was whispering in his ear. Aunt Joyce looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The lawyer stacked the papers neatly and said, this trust owns a property currently valued at $2,700,000 0 cents. Congratulations, Miss Wainwright. Marcus exploded. He manipulated an old man. That land should have gone to the family. To me. Caleb calmly stepped forward. You mean the family that laughed while my mom got scraps? The family that treated her like furniture while you all ate at the table? Marcus turned on me red-faced. You really planned this? You let us sit here while you played victim? I stood, slow and steady. No, I didn't plan this. I walked in expecting nothing. Like always. I looked at Caleb, but my son, he gave me back something you all tried to take. Dignity. The lawyer handed me the folder. My name was printed clearly on every page. No loopholes, no tricks. Just undeniable ownership of something my father had once quietly secured and then buried beneath years of neglect. Why? I didn't know. Maybe guilt? Maybe shame? Maybe one sliver of him knew I was more than they gave me credit for. Either way, the silence around that table now felt earned. It was the sound of power shifting. Caleb finally sat down, exhaling like he'd been holding the truth for too long. I slipped my arm around his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded. "You shouldn't have had to walk in here alone, Mom." I looked across the room, taking in their shocked faces, and realized something crystal clear. This wasn't about land or money. It was about respect, about what happens when people who dismissed you for years suddenly realize they miscalculated. My father might not have said the words I needed in his lifetime, but he'd left behind proof that I mattered. And my son, my quiet, brilliant son, made sure they heard it when it counted. I stood tall and addressed them all. For years, I let you define me, overlook me, diminish me. Today, I take it all back. I picked up my bag, folder in hand. We're done here. And with that, I walked out of the will reading, head high, heels clicking, my son beside me. I didn't just leave with land. I left with legacy. I knew they wouldn't let it go. That kind of entitlement doesn't just shrivel up and die quietly. Sure enough, not even 48 hours after the will reading, I got an email from a legal firm I didn't recognize. A formal inquiry has been submitted requesting an immediate review of the DC Legacy Trust on the grounds of undue influence and possible forgery. Yeah, I didn't need to guess who was behind it. Marcus and Aunt Joyce had likely huddled together the moment I left that conference room, eyes wide and egos shattered. I could almost hear them. There's no way Dad gave her that. She must have manipulated him. What they didn't know, what they never understood, was that this wasn't just a lucky break. This was strategy. And Caleb, he didn't play checkers. He played When I showed him the email, he didn't flinch. "I figured they'd try this," he said calmly. "So I built a wall before they even saw the gate." I blinked. "What kind of wall?" He reached into his backpack and pulled out another folder, neater, thicker, with tabs and color-coded notes. The trust was filed with an addendum, a notarized video from the lawyer who helped Grandpa draft it. There's also an audio file of Grandpa explaining the trust in his own words, time-stamped, backed by metadata, and logged on 2 separate encrypted drives. My jaw dropped. You recorded Grandpa? Caleb shrugged. He wanted to. He said, no one's going to believe I gave my daughter more than a paper plate at Thanksgiving. Let's make it official. The pain behind those words stung, but I couldn't help smiling. My father might have failed me in life, but in that one quiet act, he gave me something none of them could take back. Proof. And my son? He had locked that proof behind digital steel. 3 days later, their lawyer tried to schedule mediation. Caleb refused. Let them file, he said. The moment they do, we trigger our release clause. I raised an eyebrow. Release clause? He smiled. The trust has a contingency. If anyone contests its legitimacy, we're legally allowed to disclose all supporting materials to the press. My eyes widened. You serious? Grandpa wanted transparency. I made sure we had it. And just like that, Marcus's plan imploded. His lawyer backed off. Aunt Joyce went quiet. The inquiry was dropped without explanation, but the silence was loud enough to be felt. Caleb had anticipated their attack and met it with undeniable facts. Facts they couldn't twist, facts they couldn't erase, facts that didn't care about who sat at the head of the table every. Later that week, I received a single text from Marcus. You think this makes you better than the rest of us? I replied, I didn't need to, because this wasn't about being better. It was about being free. That night, I made Caleb his favorite dinner, pan-seared salmon with lemon, butter, and garlic rice. We sat in the kitchen, just the two of us, as the rain tapped softly against the windows. You know, I said, I still don't understand how you thought of all this. You're 16. I didn't know how to cook rice at 16. He grinned. You always taught me to be prepared. I just took it seriously. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the reflection of every fight I had endured alone, every silent sacrifice I made to give him a different kind of life. He was my proof that I had not failed, that the strength I carried wasn't just survival, it was legacy, passed down in grit and wisdom and quiet resilience. Your grandfather might not have said the words I needed, I said slowly, but you did. And you made sure everyone else heard them too. Caleb looked down, embarrassed by praise, but proud underneath. I just wanted them to see who you really are. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. They did, baby, and now they can never unsee it. It wasn't over. I knew Marcus wouldn't just crawl away after his failed legal play. He thrived on being the center of the family universe. And nothing threatened him more than the idea that I'd stepped into a spotlight he believed belonged solely to him. So I wasn't surprised when I got an email about a memorial business luncheon being hosted in Dad's honor, a celebration of his legacy with a panel discussion and press invite. The catch? I hadn't been invited, not officially. Caleb found the flyer buried on the event website. Marcus was the keynote speaker. The description read, Robert T. Wainwright's empire lives on through the vision and leadership of his only true successor, his son, Marcus Wainwright. I stared at the screen, stunned, then laughed so hard I nearly choked. He really called himself Dad's only successor? I said to Caleb. He didn't laugh. He just smiled. Cool, calculated, calm. Then I guess we need to remind him how badly he misread the will. We didn't crash the event. We RSVP'd through one of the event partners. Caleb's friend's mom worked in corporate PR and slid us in under the radar. We showed up clean, professional, with digital copies of the trust documents and audio files tucked safely in a slim folder I carried under my arm. The ballroom buzzed with energy, business cards flying, drinks clinking. Marcus stood on stage in a navy suit, his voice amplified as he told a room full of investors and family friends how Dad's mentorship molded me into the man I am today. I held back a smirk. I hadn't realized just how much Marcus had leaned into the myth of himself. Our family's legacy, he continued, has always been rooted in vision. That's why I'm announcing the launch of the Wainwright Leadership Fund, modeled after the principles my father passed directly to me. There it was, the money grab, the public pitch. He wasn't just trying to rewrite history, he was using Dad's name to fund his next ego trip. The Q&A session came next. Caleb raised his hand and the moderator pointed to him. Yes, you there. Caleb stood. Quick question. How does the Wainwright Leadership Fund plan to integrate the assets managed under the DC Legacy Trust? You could have heard a pin drop. Marcus's smile twitched. I'm not familiar with that entity, he lied. Caleb nodded. Strange. It was established by your father in 2007. It owns 14 acres of commercial land that's currently being developed, and it's under the management of his daughter and grandson. Would you like us to send over the original filings? Murmurs rippled across the room. Marcus looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. I stood slowly, folder in hand. For full transparency, I said, we've prepared a statement, and anyone interested in honoring Robert Wainwright's true legacy is welcome to review the trust themselves. I handed the folder to the moderator, who looked as rattled as Marcus did. Cameras clicked, phones recorded. The illusion had cracked, and the whole room watched it crumble. We didn't stay long after that. We didn't have to. By the time we reached the car, Caleb's phone was blowing up with messages. Some from reporters, others from attendees who had long suspected Marcus's ego outpaced his integrity. The event was trending within the hour. Hashtags like Wainwright Legacy Truth and Forgot the Daughter began spreading on business Twitter and real estate forums. Caleb pulled out his earbuds and said, check this out. Someone just posted a side-by-side of your will reading and Marcus's speech. You're winning the internet today. I smiled, more tired than triumphant. We weren't trying to humiliate him, I said quietly. No, Caleb replied. But he did that all on his own. That night, I lay in bed thinking about my father. Not the man who forgot my birthdays, but the one who quietly tucked away a trust for the daughter he never could fully face. Maybe he didn't know how to love me out loud. Maybe he left it to Caleb to finish what he couldn't start. Either way, his silence wasn't the final word anymore. Ours was, and the whole world had heard it. The morning after the luncheon takedown, I woke up to an email with the subject line, Estate Archive for Dana Wainwright. At first, I thought it was another legal follow-up, maybe a real estate form or trust statement, but when I opened it, I saw something entirely different. A scanned letter, old and yellow, dated exactly 5 months before my father passed. The email came from his former assistant, Andrea, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Her message was short. I found this while clearing out old records. He wrote it, sealed it, and asked me to send it to you if anything ever happened to him. I'm sorry it took me this long. The letter was in his handwriting, slanted, familiar, careful. I held my breath and started reading. Dana, if you're seeing this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't say this to your face. I didn't know how. I wasn't the father you deserved. Not when you were a little girl. Not when you needed me to choose you. But I watched you. I saw you fight your way through college. I saw you raise that boy right. I saw how you did it all, with no help from me. You didn't just survive, you built. I gave Marcus everything, and still he always needed more. You had almost nothing from me, and still you gave Caleb the kind of love that built a man. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted to leave something that proved I knew your worth, even if I never said it out loud. That trust isn't charity, it's recognition. It's proof that I knew who the real legacy was. You didn't just carry my name. You rebuilt its meaning. I hope one day you'll understand. Dad. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there reading it over and over like my heart needed confirmation. My father never said those things to me while he was alive. Not once. But somewhere in him, he knew. He saw the truth even when he couldn't bring himself to speak it. And while that didn't erase the years of distance, it gave the pain a place to settle. It didn't float anymore. It landed. I forwarded the email to Caleb. A few minutes later, he walked into the room, barefoot, phone in hand. You okay? I nodded. Yeah, I think I finally am. He sat down beside me and read the letter again. He was wrong about a lot, Caleb said, but he was right about one thing. What's that? I asked. You're the legacy. Later that afternoon, we got another message, this time from a local nonprofit that had attended the luncheon. They'd seen the viral clips and were looking to partner with us for a youth housing project on a nearby plot of land owned by the trust. I took the meeting out of curiosity. They were good people, community-driven, transparent. The project would house teens aging out of foster care. They weren't offering a paycheck. They were offering a partnership, a seat at the table. You've proven you can build things, one of the board members said. We just want to help you build something that lasts. It was the first time someone saw me not just as the daughter of someone powerful, but as a woman capable of leading on her own terms. I signed the agreement that week. Caleb would help with digital strategy. I would oversee operations. We called it the Second Start Initiative, and we made sure my father's name wasn't printed anywhere on it. Not out of anger, but because this time, the future wasn't his to write, it was ours. The knock on my door came early Saturday morning. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I certainly wasn't expecting her. Aunt Joyce stood outside my condo in a beige trench coat, her lips pursed, a Tupperware of banana bread in one hand, like we were still playing at normal family. For a second, I considered not opening the door, but curiosity tugged harder than resentment. I cracked it open. "Surprised to see you," I said, keeping my tone even. She gave me a tired smile. "I won't stay long. I just needed to talk." I let her in without a word. She placed the bread on the table like a peace offering, then sat slowly, like her body was heavier than it used to be. "I saw the clips from the luncheon," she said. "I also heard about the trust, the land, all of it." I said nothing. She clasped her hands. "You probably hate me." "I don't," I said. "I just don't trust you." She flinched. That's fair." For a while, we just sat there, the silence stretching until she finally broke it. "Your father didn't leave you out of the will because he forgot you, Dana." My heart clenched. "He left you out?" she continued. "Because I told him to." I froze. "You what?" She took a deep breath. "Years ago, when your mother and Robert split, it wasn't clean. There were accusations, legal threats. You were too young to understand. Your mother was hurt, angry, and loud, and I told your father the best thing he could do was distance himself from you." "You told him to abandon his daughter?" I whispered. "I told him he wasn't good for you, that his presence would do more harm than good." "I didn't say it out of hate, Dana. I said it because your mother begged me to keep you stable. She thought if he was gone, you'd have peace. But what none of us thought about was what that absence would cost you. I never realized he'd take it so literally." I sat there, stunned. My entire childhood had felt like a slow fade, and now I had the reason. Not because I wasn't wanted, but because two adults decided for me what my relationship with my father should be. "You never told me," I said. "You let me believe he just didn't care. Because by the time I realized how much damage we'd done," she said, voice breaking, "I didn't think it would help." She looked at me, eyes glassy. "I'm sorry, Dana. I've been carrying this for years. Watching you fight for space you should have been given freely. I can't fix it, but I can tell you the truth." I swallowed hard. "Why now?" "Because I saw the way your son stood up for you, and I realized you don't need protecting anymore. You needed the truth, even if it hurts." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just nodded, slowly. "Thank you for telling me. But this doesn't erase the years I spent wondering if I mattered." She nodded, eyes full of quiet grief. "I know. But maybe it explains why your father tried to make it right in the end." After she left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the wind ripple through the trees. Her words kept replaying in my mind, not for what they said, but for what they confirmed. All those years of confusion, of half-love, of silence from my father, it wasn't neglect, it was avoidance, built on a choice someone else made on my behalf. I had been grieving a version of rejection that wasn't even real. And while the truth didn't erase the pain, it clarified it. And that gave me power. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a pen, and wrote down 3 words on the back of an envelope. He did care. Then I tucked the envelope into Caleb's keepsake box, because someday he'd ask about all of this. And when he did, I wanted him to know that even the ugliest family truths can't bury the light we build on top of them. My father made mistakes. My family kept secrets. But I built something stronger than silence. I built a voice, and it would never be muted again. The news stories hadn't faded yet. Even weeks later, people were still sharing clips of Caleb's truth bomb at the will reading, the luncheon showdown, and the viral contrast between my silent entrance and Marcus's collapse. Reporters emailed, bloggers speculated, someone even suggested a podcast series about the daughter who won the family war. I ignored it all at first, but the one request I couldn't shake came from the local business journal. The editor, a woman named Renee, asked for an exclusive interview, not just about the trust, but about the legacy. People think they know what happened, she said, but they don't know you. I didn't answer right away because part of me didn't want to rehash it. The pain, the silence, the moments that shaped me but still weighed me down. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. I was just trying to live. But Caleb noticed the message on my desk. You should tell them, he said. Not for them, for you. I looked at him. What would I even say? He smiled. You'd say the truth. You always have. That's what makes it different when you say it. That night, I pulled out the letter again, my father's words still folded neatly in the envelope Andrea had sent. I read them slowly, like each line still needed time to settle in. That trust isn't charity, it's recognition. You didn't just carry my name, you rebuilt its meaning. I whispered the words aloud, not because I needed to hear them, but because I wanted to feel them leave my mouth, like they finally belonged to me. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, opened a blank document, and started writing. I didn't know where it would go. I just wrote. I wrote about the years I spent wondering why he couldn't look me in the eye. I wrote about watching Marcus be lifted while I stayed invisible. I wrote about the way my mother always told me, you're stronger, that's why they lean on you. But most of all, I wrote about the moment I realized my worth wasn't dependent on anyone's acknowledgement. Not my father's, not Marcus's, not the world's. I had always been the legacy, they just didn't know it yet. I sent the story to Renee with no expectations. She published it 2 days later under the headline, The Forgotten Daughter, How I Reclaimed a Legacy No One Wanted Me to Have. I didn't expect what came next. Emails from women I'd never met. Messages from quiet daughters, from overlooked sons, from people who had been the backup plan in their own families. One said, I've been invisible my whole life. Your story made me feel seen. Another wrote, thank you for saying what so many of us never had the chance to. I realized something in that moment. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. Sharing the story didn't bring back what I lost, but it gave weight to what I had gained. A life lived with eyes open, voice steady, truth intact. Even Caleb read the article twice. You really did it, he said. You told it your way. I did, I replied. And for once, I didn't edit myself to make anyone else comfortable. Weeks later, the article was nominated for a small journalism award. I didn't care about the recognition. What meant more was the message I got from Andrea, my father's old assistant. He tried to say all of that for years. He just never knew how. But you said it perfectly. And maybe that was the legacy. Not the land, not the money, not even the story itself, but the courage to speak after years of being silenced. I didn't write to get even. I wrote to get free, to lay it all bare, to say what needed saying, not for revenge, but for clarity. Because when the dust settles and the names fade and the family photos collect dust in some forgotten drawer, what remains isn't what they gave you. It's what you refuse to give up. And I refuse to give up my voice. The invitation came through Marcus's wife. Not directly from him, of course not. It was a polite group text about a family barbecue at their new house in honor of Dad, with a soft note at the bottom. All are welcome. Let's move forward. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was torn. Emotionally, I'd already stepped beyond the games, but something in me wanted to look them in the eye one last time. Not for revenge, not even for validation. I wanted to see if they'd changed or if they just decided to tolerate my presence now that they couldn't erase it. Caleb raised an eyebrow when I showed him. You going? I think I am, I said. But not to prove anything, just to exist in full view, as I am. Unapologetic. He nodded. You already won. This is just a victory lap. I smiled. Exactly. I wore a simple blue wrap dress, no designer label, no flashy entrance. But the second I walked into that backyard, everything paused. Marcus looked up from the grill, and for the first time in my entire life, he didn't smirk. He looked aware. His wife gave me a tight smile. Joy stood near the drink table and nodded, but didn't speak. A few cousins drifted toward me. One whispered, Glad you came. We've been reading everything. Proud of you. I didn't expect support, but I wasn't surprised either. Because once the silence breaks, people who felt voiceless start to rise too. Caleb stayed close, calm as ever. We moved like we belonged. Because now we did. I didn't rush into conversations. I didn't shrink. I accepted a plate, poured my own drink, and joined the fold like someone who wasn't waiting for permission. Later, Marcus walked over, not confrontational, just tired. You know, he said, for years I thought I had to carry everything Dad built. I took a sip of lemonade. You didn't carry it. You just inherited it. He nodded slowly. Fair. I guess I never thought you'd push back the way you did. I looked him in the eye. That's the difference between us. You needed to be handed power to feel like you mattered. I realized I didn't need their permission to matter at all. He didn't argue, just let out a breath. So, now what? Now, I said, I live, and I stopped shrinking to make other people comfortable. He looked around at the family. They'll never admit they were wrong, I smiled. They don't have to. I'm not here for their guilt. I'm here for my peace. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked to the edge of the yard with Caleb. We stood there quietly, watching kids run with sparklers, the glow of citronella candles flickering in the twilight. Feels different now, huh? He said. I nodded. Not because they changed, but because I did. I turned and looked back at the group. Faces that once made me feel invisible now looked like echoes. I had mourned their approval for years, but now I saw it for what it was, a moving target I was never meant to chase. And still, I'd built something lasting, a truth, a sun, a name reclaimed from the shadows. We can go if you're ready, Caleb said. I smiled and shook my head. No, we stay a little longer. Not to prove I belong, but to enjoy the feeling of not needing to. The email subject line read, Keynote Invitation Women in Legacy Leadership Summit. At first, I thought it was spam, some PR trap or another thinly veiled brand push. But when I read the body, I realized it was real and it was personal. The organizers had read the article Renee published. They saw the clips of the luncheon and the buzz around the Second Start initiative, and they wanted me, Dana Wainwright, to speak about building legacy without inheritance. I sat with the email for 3 days, not because I didn't want to say yes, but because I knew the second I stepped on that stage, I'd be rewriting the version of my story people had been told for years. I wasn't just the girl who got nothing in her father's will. I wasn't just the quiet daughter. I was the one who built something lasting in the shadows and who decided finally to speak in the light. The event was in Chicago, a ballroom filled with business leaders, investors, nonprofit founders, and next-generation change makers. The crowd was mostly women, most of them sitting where I used to, quiet, sharp, undercredited. When I stepped up to the podium, the lights warmed my face and the hum of anticipation filled the air. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I took a breath, looked around, and began. My name is Dana Wainwright. You probably know me as the daughter who didn't get mentioned in her father's will. That's true. But what's also true is that legacy doesn't start with inheritance. It starts with resilience. The silence was complete. I told them how I was raised on the sidelines, how I poured everything I had into building something my family never saw until it threatened their version of the story. I told them about Caleb, my quiet fighter, and how he didn't just speak for me. He reminded me that I had the right to speak for myself. I didn't list my accomplishments. I told the truth. I told them how I was made to feel disposable, how the people closest to me treated my strength as an excuse to never protect me, how silence was my survival tool, until it wasn't. I didn't get the house, the car, the bank account, but I got something better. I got proof that you can build without being handed anything. And once you do, no one can ever take it from you. A few heads nodded, a few eyes welled up. If you've ever been overlooked, counted out, or treated like your value only matters when it benefits someone else, know this. You're not missing anything. You are not behind. You are not small. You are powerful. The moment you decide your story isn't over. I ended with that. No dramatic close, no applause line, just the truth. And it landed like thunder. The standing ovation was unexpected, not because I didn't believe I had something to offer, but because I was finally seeing the echo of what it meant to speak without shrinking. Afterward, a line formed. Women of every age, background, and title came up to shake my hand. "That was my story," one whispered. "You just gave me permission to stop apologizing," another said. I smiled, thanked them, and held each moment fully. Back in my hotel room, Caleb texted me, "How'd it go?" I sent him a photo of the crowd from the stage and wrote, "I told the truth, that was enough." Because that's what I'd learned. I didn't need to outshine Marcus. I didn't need to prove anything to Aunt Joyce or the rest of the family. I just needed to speak, and now people were finally listening, not because I was loud, but because I was undeniable. When I got home from Chicago, my voice still carried the echo of that ballroom. I could feel the rhythm of the applause, the weight of the women's words, and the way my story had landed, not as a sob story, but as a declaration. I'd spoken fully and freely, but the minute I walked into my condo, it all quieted. No cameras, no crowd, just the low hum of the refrigerator, the smell of lavender from the candle Caleb lit before I left, and an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in his handwriting. I opened it slowly, expecting maybe a welcome home note, a sweet joke, or one of his sharp little sketches. But what I found wasn't just a note. It was a letter. And not just a letter, a mirror turned gently toward me. "Mom," it began, "I know I've said thank you before for dinner, for rides, for helping me finish my essays at midnight, but I don't think I've ever said thank you for being the kind of parent who taught by example. You didn't raise your voice when they ignored you. You raised me instead. You didn't beg for their attention. You built a life without it. I watched you walk through silence like it was a battlefield, and still somehow you made it look like a hallway to something better. You've shown me that legacy isn't what people leave behind when they die. It's what people live out when they finally stop apologizing for existing. But you didn't just raise me. You showed me what surviving with dignity looks like, what winning without screaming feels like, what a woman looks like when she takes her power back and builds something no one can tear down. You're not just my mother. You're the blueprint." I sat at the kitchen table, letter in hand, hands trembling, heart still. There were no tears, just a slow, deep breath. It was the kind of breath you only take when your soul recognizes that you didn't just survive something, you transformed because of it. This letter wasn't a gift. It was a truth I didn't know I'd been earning all these years. Through the moments I said nothing, through the quiet rejections, through the small victories I never celebrated. I didn't raise a boy. I raised a mirror. And in his words, I finally saw myself clearly. Not the version that craved approval, not the girl left out of the will, but the woman who taught her son how to stand tall in a world that tried to make her small. I folded the letter and tucked it into a frame on my bookshelf, right next to the documents from the DC Legacy Trust and the magazine clipping of my story. But those things, they didn't feel like the trophy anymore. This letter was it. This was the moment that made everything full circle. Because no matter how much land you own or how loud the world applauds, the greatest legacy you can leave is the strength in someone else's spine because of how you carried your own. Caleb walked through the door just as I finished. "You found it?" he asked, shrugging off his backpack. I did. I stood, crossed the kitchen, and wrapped him in a hug that said everything. He didn't hug me like a child. He hugged me like someone who knew I'd spent years holding everything up, alone. And now I didn't have to anymore. That evening, I sat on the balcony and watched the sun stretch across the sky like a final note held too long. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I wasn't fighting to be seen. I had become the story, one I wrote, one I owned, and one I passed on in every decision I made. My name wasn't forgotten. It wasn't omitted. It was now written in places they could never erase. And my son, he would never wonder how much he mattered. Because I had shown him in every quiet act of defiance, every moment I chose dignity over begging, every time I told the truth when it would have been easier to swallow it. My father's will didn't name me, but his final act and my son's voice made sure the world knew me. And that was more than any inheritance. That was a legacy. A legacy. They left her name out of the will. They laughed like she didn't matter. But her son stood up and spoke the truth no one was ready to hear. She didn't inherit the empire. She became one. Not with money, but with grit, voice, and a legacy that couldn't be denied. Because when the family forgets your worth, sometimes it takes the next generation to remind them who you really are. Like, subscribe, and remember, legacy isn't what they give you. It's what you build without them.